Good afternoon and welcome to the Ukraine and Russia war studio discussion. It is still a very hot topic in spite of other different events, war events which are popping up, such as in Israel currently, but it's still a very actual one. So what we're going to do in this session is to have a broad discussion on the Ukraine war. Its origins, what's happening currently, and the implications and future path. It is one of these wars which has divided the world between two camps, and where it is increasingly difficult for countries to maintain a neutral stance on the issue, to be either neutral or to not pick one side, so to be non-aligned. And this is clearly evident in this region, in the Indo-Pacific, where countries are being lobbied either by Russia, Ukraine, United States to pick a side. And so what we're going to do here is have a critical look, because this war has wider geopolitical and geoeconomic implications, not only for Europe and the Indo-Pacific, but more widely. Some have stated that this has implications for even the current global geopolitical order. And what I'm talking about here is the Western-centric US unipolar hegemony, which has been under a relative decline for some time now, and this rising non-Western-centric multipolar world, which this region is definitely a part of. So we will discuss now. I am the moderator, and Vlada is the panelist. Our second panelist is not here, so today I shall wear two hats as a moderator and as a panelist. But I will switch to Vlada, and in your opinion, I mean, what are the origins of this conflict? I mean, why has it begun, and what is at stake at the basic level?
Well, I think it's very clear that Russia has always had imperial ambitions. And if the last war that was started in 2014 wasn't enough, we've come back now into a second conflict. And it's very important to note that in this situation, Ukraine is not the aggressor. We did not come on Russian land, Russia came on our land. And the world may forget that in 2014, a chunk of territory was taken, Crimea. This is Ukrainian land. Crimea is Ukraine. I'll say it over and over and over. And at the end of the day, it wasn't enough. And so to those that now position this conflict to saying, well, maybe Ukraine should settle. Well, maybe Ukraine should give up some of its territory. Unfortunately, that's not an option. It wasn't enough in 2014, and it won't be enough now. And Ukraine has never conceded Crimea. That territory was taken. And so the root of this conflict, though, doesn't go back to 2014. This goes back to Putin's desire to rebuild the Soviet bloc. He's an imperialist at heart, and this is a conflict that's gone on for years and years. It even goes back to a time before even the formation of the Soviet Union, when we've had territorial disputes. But today, Ukraine fights not just for its land, but for the existence, to say that we can still have a Ukraine in the future. And Israel can certainly relate to this. They are fighting this fight right now themselves.
Okay, thank you. But it gives a lot of food for thought. And now I will switch from being moderator to panelist, and as a protagonist, bring some counter arguments that have been used, not only by Russia, but other actors. So, I mean, one of the agreements is that this predates 2022 and predates 2014. You have a certain camp, especially if we're looking at former foreign policy and intelligence community people. I'm sure you're aware of the different ones from the US, such as Jack Matlock and Ray McGovern, there's Douglas McGregor, and these other people. The basic argument, if we sort of dissect it, is, and they agree with you that this predates it, but it's a different reason altogether, and this relates to the expansion of NATO, which was actually promised by the US, by Baker, in a meeting with Mikhail Gorbachev, if he gave up East Germany, that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward, using his particular words. And so subsequently there have been a number of moves to the east, NATO. And if we go back to 2008, Russia did draw 2 red lines with NATO membership, and of course this was just before the 2008 Georgian-Russian War, which occurred with similar, shall we say, settings or backgrounds. And if we look at what's happening, one of the arguments, and this is coming from the likes of McGregor and others, not to mention this ATO, as it was called, anti-terrorist operation, which was launched in 2014. And subsequently, the Ukrainian military did kill, quite a number of civilians. It was about 10,000, 12,000 over the years, maybe slightly more. And that's according to the OSCE mission, which was observing. And they were observing until just before this military offensive, what the Russians call the SMO, Special Military Operation, what the rest of the world calls the Ukraine-Russia War. So looking at that, one of the reasons for their withdrawal was a build-up of Ukrainian military close to Donbass. This was according to them. And this seemingly imminent offensive which was about to start. So this comes down to the basic dilemma which is brought about by the likes of Mersheimer. So he's this dilemma. That is, when one country takes security at the expense of another country, eventually that other country will react. And of course this works both ways. It's not unilateral in any way. So we have a very murky one. It's a very contested. Who began the war? Why did the war begin? You have not only those who state that Russia wants to recreate the Soviet Union, but to recreate the Russian Empire, which was actually territorially bigger than the Soviet Union. But then you have what Putin says himself. Okay, on the one hand, he says that the breakup of the Soviet Union was a geopolitical catastrophe. But on the other hand, anyone who wants to recreate the Soviet Union, to use a very New Zealandish kind of interpretation of his expression, needs their head examined because it's not possible and it's not desirable for a number of reasons. And I think perhaps one thing which is built within this is this idea that the war in Ukraine is not only about Ukraine, but it's about Europe and which direction that Europe will go. Will it have relations with Russia, or will the US keep out Russia from the European territory? And you have the likes of the 2019 RAND report, which talked about cost-imposing Russia actions on the Russian Federation, on the territory of such as Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Southern Caucasus. So we have a very complicated, and with complication comes greater room for miscalculation, error, emotions, which I think are perhaps the most dangerous thing in any conflict. Okay, now my personality will change and I will now be moderator again. So, okay, Vladimir, we have this origins of this conflict. And I mean, from our discussion, it's contested. It depends where you stand, what is your geopolitical preference, other different matters. But where is this going? I mean, we've had this discussion of this Ukrainian offensive, for example, whether it's taking territory or it's not taking territory, the growing casualties, growing disruption. You have this wariness, I suppose, which one can say. For example, the actions of Poland, Hungary, Romania towards Ukrainian grain, this issue that they're saying we don't have many more weapons to give, and I think maybe one of the more telling ones was how President Zelensky was treated at the Vilnius summit when they stood on the podium and people turned their back to him. It was an interesting moment if one looks at the body language of this. So, I mean, on the one hand, Ukraine and its conflict has been promoted as this strategic interest of Western democracies for the security of Europe, and not to mention the aspects concerning Ukrainian sovereignty and these particular matters. But now you're starting to have this coalition which was singing with one voice is now beginning to have multiple voices. I mean, in your opinion, I mean, why is this happening? I mean, what is causing this? And where do you see this going from here?
I think I'll start with first unpacking a lot of what was said in the participant role that you played, which was a very Russia-centric perspective. And it's a perspective that's certainly allowed to be brought to the table. And it certainly addresses issues that I want to respond to. And the first, let's first start with the two arguments that Russia makes when it comes to this war. NATO is the first argument, but I'll come back to it. I want to start with the language argument. We are protecting the Russian-speaking population. The Russian-speaking citizens of Ukraine are being threatened, and we must go in to protect this population, and we must save them. Sitting in front of you is a Ukrainian girl from Odessa that only speaks Russian. This is the first language I learned. This is the only language I learned. I immigrated out of the country for my education, and it came back into Ukraine in my 20s. I do not speak Ukrainian, and I have never been persecuted in my country based on this, and don't know one other Russian-speaking citizen that only speaks Russian in cities like Kharkiv, where I did a massive amount of work and ran an election campaign, which is a very Russian-speaking city right on the border with Russia. And so that certainly is an argument that not only I can personally answer to, but an argument that has been dispelled over and over. Now going back to the big one that Russia likes to speak about, NATO. I think you and I both know quite well that not in 3 years, not in 5 years, not in 10, Ukraine was running to NATO and could join in that kind of time period. That just isn't the case. But Russia's argument, continuous argument on NATO, if that was really a fear that Russia had when it came to NATO, in turn, you have countries that have over 200 years neutrality, that have had over 200 years neutrality, that are now fleeing and joining NATO. So actually, it in turn resulted in the complete opposite. So if Russia's fear was NATO and more countries joining NATO in the buildup, then what it's done in turn is create the opposite effect. You've got Sweden and Finland that are all running to NATO now. So the argument that Russia makes is not an argument that, considering the fact that it's bordered by other NATO nations, I think it's simply an excuse for what is happening in the region. And I will certainly always go back to the fact that for years, Ukrainians have been suppressed. The Ukrainian language was suppressed. My great-grandparents were kicked off of their land in Venetia and forced out into modern-day Moldova. And many of my relatives moved back to Ukraine, stayed in Ukraine. But I have this is a fight that certainly goes back quite far. But the NATO argument is an argument that Russia continues to make, is simply an excuse. I think it's completely created such a rush for countries to join NATO like never before. And I think the argument that Ukraine was on its way to joining NATO in some short period of time, it wasn't. Ukraine is a sovereign nation, and to have a discussion at some point in the future of looking towards NATO is completely within Ukraine's right. So I think those two arguments are important arguments that are often brought to the table. But now going back to the regions, Lugansk, Donetsk, regions I visited many, many times. And in those regions, even after 2014, many of those regions had Russian separatists that were dressing as Ukrainian soldiers and trying to push forward and claiming that those are Ukrainians murdering civilians. That just is not fully accurate information. There was conflict from both sides in that region, but Ukraine was defending its territory. Ukraine wasn't going door to door murdering civilians. And it's very hard. It's very, very hard. I just came out of Ukraine. It's very hard to even sit here knowing, putting emotions aside, but looking at the reality that Russia continues to this day to bomb areas where civilians are. Kharkiv just had a huge amount of casualties that were all civilians under the auspice of military operation. It's not a special military operation. We're in a full-blown war, and it's happening on our land, being paid for by our soldiers, the bodies of Ukrainian men and women. And it's really unfortunate that Russia's being allowed to get away with it. Sanctions are just a slap on the wrist at the end of the day. But I kind of want to look at broader, what the broader implications for the world are of this war. We can talk for hours, days, and go back and forth on who Russia blamed. But at the end of the day, Russia is one of the strongest military powers in the world. I think it was ranked number 2 or 3 in the world militarily. Ukraine was nowhere on that list. So to say that Ukraine was some inherent horrible threat to Russia is a laughable matter. Ukraine's population compared to Russia's population is just a third of the size. And so I think that to say that Ukraine was some massive threat to Russia, again, just an excuse from Russia's side. But the broader implications are that you have two countries right now at war that are massive grain producers. And we talk about the Indo-Pacific region, which I think is very relevant to the Bay of Bengal conference. And this region, Bangladesh is one of the countries that receives grain from Ukraine, that consumes Ukrainian grain. It's China, Pakistan, I believe, and Bangladesh. Mm-hmm. That's 32 million tons of grain that is spread, Ukrainian grain, across 45 different countries across the globe on 3 continents. So very significant. So I think the broader implications of what the world is suffering with is you have countries that are the breadbaskets of the world. This has severe implications for countries like Bangladesh, where we're sitting today. And I think that's absolutely important to know, that it's in everyone's interest that this conflict ends. But the problem is that there's not a real solution in sight. Ukraine is being asked to negotiate with a gun being held to their head. How do you come to the negotiation table when there's Russian soldiers on your territory, there's not a ceasefire? I mean, how do you come into negotiation? And I think countries, even in the region we're sitting in, like India, have to step up to the plate to also be willing to play some sort of honest broker role. And maybe India isn't the perfect country, in the region for that, but this is very important if we're going to see a resolution to the conflict in some way. I mean, on the Ukrainian side, you'll probably have US, UK, France, that kind of honest broker on their side. On the Russia side, you're certainly going to probably see China. But who's going to play the middle role? who's going to play the middle role in being the honest broker between the two to try to broker some sort of peace? And a few countries have tried, but none of the countries in this region have really gotten on board to try that. And I certainly would love to see India at some point step up to that role, despite the fact that they consume, a massive amount of Russian oil. I think that Prime Minister Modi can play a serious role in that.
Okay, yeah. No, there's lots of different points there to bring up, both nationally, regionally, and internationally. And now I revert to my naughty panelist role. So, okay, yes, I mean, Odessa is a very specific city.
My hometown.
Yes, I've been there plenty of times.
Yes.
So it's certainly not got a Ukrainian, if we want to, whatever that is, vibe to it, but a more, it's Ukraine, but it's specific city. And I mean, so that's on the one hand, and I mean the other cities you mentioned, but if you go to the Kiev, which is somewhere in between, this in-between world, or if you go to Lviv, which is something quite different, then you get a completely different atmosphere. And I mean, I have had people talk to me in places like Donetsk some time ago, Sevastopol, Dnepropetrovsk, and so forth, who say, yes, it is not easy being a Russian speaker with what they call the process of Ukrainianization, this bringing of the Ukrainian language into the system of education. So, I mean, it's a very nuanced and problematic issue because this language is being linked to identity, and from that different presumptions can come forth in terms of loyalty to the state. I mean, Latvia does a similar extrapolation with Latvian speakers and Russian speakers. But if we look at the wider implications, so we'll get out of Ukraine and this more Indo-Pacific. Yeah, I mean, India has been put on the spot by the US, but has not budged, and seems to be holding on to this non-aligned movement rather than choosing one side too much or the other. Which, I mean, this is how they perceive their national interests, and this is how they seek to project themselves as a subject of international relations, because they don't want to become an object of it, especially when you've got a neighbour such as China. If you become an object in these games, it can get, well, as Ukraine knows, it can get quite nasty. So, yeah, you've got all of these things linked together, this geopolitics and geoeconomics linked together, the rather ineffectual sanctions, and sanctions have never been something which has been really effective historically. They tend to produce the opposite effect. The Americans sanctioned Japan and they got Pearl Harbor, so these things can backfire. And what we see now is that the US is starting to do these sanctions and so forth, and you can see the expansion of BRICS, and you can see these alternative things. You can see what they called allies in the past, such as UAE, Saudi Arabia, and other countries which are de-dollarizing. And so where we're going, it's going to be, as the Chinese say, we will live in interesting times, I suspect. But if we wrap up this place, I mean, there are implications for this region, and some of them are playing out now. One of them, if we look at even before the war started in Ukraine, you had two similar narratives in Western mainstream media: the imminent and inevitable invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and the imminent and inevitable invasion of Taiwan by China, which are almost identical. You just change the names of the actors. So I think what this has done for this region, it's made them quite, to use the expression, gun-shy, to become too involved, because if a country becomes too involved, it can lose its autonomy. And if you lose your autonomy, things can go very badly. I mean, this plays out badly when, for example, if we look at the Finnish case historically, they had an unprovoked Soviet attack in 1939, 1940. And that is when they were a subject of events. And so naturally it makes one emotional, it wants one to get some revenge. And so they joined Nazi Germany and in the attack on the Soviet Union. And that's when they became an object, because they were part of the Nazi war effort and geostrategy. And well, the result was not good for Finnish sovereignty, security, etc. So I think that history plays a much bigger role in this region than it does in Europe. People tend to have a very short term memory when it comes to this. So if we look at the Indo-Pacific, there are clear implications. There are implications from the beginning, and there are ones which are emerging in terms of geoeconomics and geopolitics, which we both talked about. But I suspect that we will soon find out what actually transpires, and the focus of people tends to be short term. Ukraine has been at war since February last year, and now you've got other wars coming up. So I think one of the biggest threats, if we want to put it that, is the marketplace of attention in terms of international support. So it is a matter of watch this space, but I think for a very lively, interactive discussion, and thank you.